Okay, hello everyone. My name is Clara, and I'm going to be the moderator for this first part of this session. So I want to thank you first for coming for this event. We'll discuss the theme, democratic efforts on the brink, what is happening in the Middle East and North Africa. So my name is Clara, and I'm one of the 100 members of FUF Stockholm Södra, which is a newly established association with over 100 members already. Before we begin this seminar, I'll give you a short introduction to who we are. For the ones who are not familiar with FUF, the Swedish Development Forum in English, we are an association driven by committed volunteers, passionate about raising the global development debate among young people and students in Stockholm. If you want anything, we want more information about us, we have an email and social media that you can contact us if you need. It's also important to know why we decided to do this seminar and this theme. As you all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has deepened the economic and social problems in many countries, which could exacerbate the pre-existing democratic challenges, especially in the Middle East and North Africa, which we have shortened to the MENA region. Additionally, with the current situation in Palestine and Israel, we believe that it's important to discuss the issues from a research perspective as well. So I would like to highlight some key points. So first, the seminar will be recorded and shared on the FUF YouTube channel. So you can also see other recorded seminars on this channel if you want to see what we've done earlier. If you're not comfortable being recorded, then you can turn your cameras off at this point. Otherwise, you will be recorded. You are, of course, more than welcome to have your camera on, but please make sure that your mic is muted so you're not disturbing any part of the presentation. Lastly, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat or during the discussion part of the session. Kaisa, my FUF friend, will present the questions from the chat to our guest speaker in the end of the session. So today's session, it will be with Elisenda Ballesté Buxó from International ID. Elisenda works as a project coordinator and manages the EU co-funded online monitoring tool for COVID-19 measures adopted by 162 countries covered in the Global State of Democracy indices. Her work in the Middle East and experience on education earned her the invitation from the UN to present a lecture on how education can be used as a tool on the effort on the resolution of the Arab-Israel conflict in the UN meeting of civil society in support of the Israeli-Palestinian peace. So today, Elisenda's presentation will cover the key democratic trends and challenges in this region that has been observed in the last 5 years. She will also shed some light on some of the implications that the government measures to combat COVID-19 pandemic have had on democracy and human rights in the region. We are very thankful for her to have you here today and to speak to all of us. Now it's time to give my word to Elisenda. You're welcome to start your presentation. Do you need to share your screen? You can do that at this point.
Thank you so much. Let me first finish with the technical things and then there you go. Can you see my presentation? Yes.
Yes.
Good. So first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me. It's always a great pleasure as a former academic to be engaged with students and youth. It's always very fulfilling. And as a Middle East specialist, I love always talking about Middle East and North Africa. So thank you for the invitation. To start with, I would like to explain a little bit of what we think at International Idea democracy is. And I also want to talk about our framework, that is what we use to measure democracy. International Idea's definition of democracy is based in two broad principles. So popular control over decision-making and the political equality in the exercise of that control. We want to think of democracy as something holistic, not as something static, because we understand that there are different kinds of democracies because countries are different. So with that in mind, we created the framework, which is divided in 5 attributes that you can see in the dark green. It's representative government, fundamental rights, checks on government, impartial administration, and participatory engagement. And we have also 16 sub-attributes that are the lighter green, and 8 subcomponents, 5 within civil liberties that are like all the freedoms, freedom of association and assembly, movement, religion, expression, etc. And then 3 subcomponents in social rights and equality, that is social group equality, basic welfare, and gender equality. So in our indices, in GSOD indices, as we call it, to shorten global state of democracy, each of the attributes, the sub-attributes, and the subcomponents are aggregated from different indicators. At the moment, we have 116 indicators that aggregated give scores to each one of the aspects. And the scores go from 0, meaning the lowest score a country can have in one of the aspects, and 1 being it, of course, the highest. And we measure 165 countries from tomorrow onwards, because from today we measure 162. And we measure it from 1975 to 2020, but I am going to use the 2019 data because, as I say, we will have the new data as of tomorrow, and it will be online next week. We update the data every week, and what we try to do is for the indices help us track democratic performance, democratic strengths, the democratic weaknesses, but also the indices can be used to compare trends across region, trends globally within the different times, compare sub-regions and also countries. And what they have proven to be more useful for is to identify areas of democratic reform for policymakers. So when they see our indices, they can say like, okay, let's see, in Zambia, the civil liberties are declining. Let's try to maybe put some efforts in improving those. So the Middle East, the GSOD indices don't measure the Middle East and North Africa as a whole. They measure the Middle East, 14 countries, and North Africa, 6 countries. In this presentation, I will refer to the region as a whole, but I will also maybe highlight when I'm talking about a specific region, because as I said, we don't measure it as a whole. So let's zoom in to the Middle East and North Africa. So for you to understand, the countries that are in orange are authoritarian regimes. The countries that are in purple, lila, they are hybrid regimes. And the countries that are in green are the democracies that we see in the region. So as you can see, the Middle East and North Africa region is quite undemocratic. It's actually the most undemocratic region in the whole world. There is just 4 democracies, Iraq, Israel, Lebanon, and Tunisia. And 2 of those democracies, Lebanon and Iraq, are extremely fragile. We have 6 regimes, hybrid regimes, and 10 authoritarian regimes. Of these 10 authoritarian regimes, 7, 6 in the Middle East and 1 in North Africa, have never been anything that an authoritarian regime since 1975 or even before. So I always like to talk about the Middle East and North Africa in both positive and negative, and explore this, like the opportunities and the challenge that the region has. And I like to do this because normally when people start talking about Middle East and North Africa, you always think about it's more normal to think about like the negative part of it, that is the most undemocratic region in the world, that the civil liberties are very curtailed. One always thinks about like gender inequality in the region, but we have to also see that there are some positive aspects, even in the democracy sphere in the Middle East and North Africa. So I'm going to start with these positive things about the Middle East and North Africa, and then we will go through these challenges and finalize with how COVID has affected or not the Middle East. So the first encouraging development that we see in the region is that the region is more democratic than it has ever been before. So even though, as you can see, the picture is not very promising, some advances have been made. So if you see the left side of the table, you can see that in 1975, there were two democracies, Israel and Lebanon. And actually Lebanon in 1976 backslid into hybridity because, as you know, there was a civil war that was taking place at that moment. And there were no democracies in North Africa. And in neither of the region, there was hybrid regimes. And there were 17 authoritarian regimes in 1975. So fast forward to 2019, we see that there have been some improvements. Instead of two democracies, now we have 4 democracies. Instead of no hybrid regimes, we have 5 hybrid regimes. And we went from 17 authoritarian regimes to 12. A lot of people think that a hybrid regime is something more towards the negative than the positive, but that is not the case for all the regions. While it is true that hybridity doesn't mean like it is a path to democracy or like a path to authoritarianism, like if depending on the way that you're going, the truth in the case of the Middle East and North Africa region is that some countries have had efforts to move away the authoritarianism towards a more democratic society. That does not mean in any case that they are like going to take out like the authoritarian tendencies and that they are going to become a democracy. No, I'm not stating that, but I am saying that there have been efforts that we measure within our framework of countries that in 1975 were in a worse democratic position that they are now. Which of course it's a great improvement. And another thing is that while democracy is not advancing at the same pace that we have seen in other regions, advances are being observed, and that is good. In the last 10, 11 years, the region has gained 2 democracies, Tunisia and Iraq, and those countries have never been a democracy before. So that is something positive that I wanted to highlight. The other encouraging development, and here you will say like, what is she talking about? But it's about gender equality. The efforts that have been made for gender equality in the region can be seen little by little. The thing is here, if you observe the trends for the Middle East and North Africa, there has been an increase over the years. I'm talking about like 44 years. The increase, of course, has not been exponential, but it has been constant. So it's like baby steps, little by little, they are advancing towards more gender equality. Much work is still needed. Again, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that it's good, that the region is good in gender equality. No, there's a lot of work to be done, but small steps are observed. And one of the steps that we can see is, for example, the quotas within the parliaments in the region. These are a step towards gender equality. So, for example, Iraq and Tunis, the 2 new democracies in the region, have introduced quotas for women in the legislative branch. In the case of Iraq, even though the country has imposed a quota reserving 25% of the seats in the Shura Council, like in their parliament, so far, women have not received enough votes to be elected beyond that quota. So far, there have only been 25% of women within the parliament because they have not been voted over that. And truth is that gender discrimination continues, as there are no structures that can assert women power in parliament. But the fact that there is a quota, the fact that women are present in the parliament, it's a huge step that needs to be also acknowledged. And then is the third encouraging development is that the little democracy that there is in the region has proven very resilient. So in most cases, when democracy is achieved in the region, it has proven resilient. For example, in Iraq, that was a non-democracy in 1975 when we started scoring our indices. It was a non-democracy, and then it transitioned to a hybrid regime in 2005, when the first multi-party elections took place in the country. Then in 2010, it became a democracy with the first fully competitive elections that took place that year. But the truth is that since becoming a hybrid regime in 2005, there have been several successful national and parliamentary elections with 3 democratic and non-violent changes of power. And this is very important because the change of power was completely peaceful. Although Iraq is considered a very weak democracy, Iraq has so far proved to be resilient and has not experienced any undemocratic interruptions since its transition in 2010. However, and I'm always saying something positive, but then I'm however, let's be careful with what we're saying. This is true, but it is also true that Iraq institutions are very weak and they are far from stable. The protest that they regained momentum at the end of 2019 and they continue now, even with COVID, they are still present, have proved a challenge to the government, which could result a change in Iraq because they are demanding a change. People are tired of the situation in Iraq. People are tired of the economic instability, the corruption, the lack of transparency, the unemployment. And we cannot lose sight that the Middle East and North Africa region is one that houses, a huge part of their population are young people that are frustrated and young people that want to change. So this also creates some challenges to the government to change and to maybe strengthen their institutions. And also the internal and the sectarian divisions in the country also threaten stability and democracy. So in Iraq, the country should work towards strengthening its democratic institutions, strengthening their accountability tools, and, as I said, decrease corruption, improve transparency, and the access to services for its citizens. And that is something that we saw during the pandemic across the region. The lack of investment in health services and in health infrastructure has been very, very damaging for the society in general. And now countries during COVID, we have seen that countries in the region are struggling between putting the restrictions in place for people not to move, so to be able to control the spread of the virus, but at the same time, their economies do not allow them, because their economies are not like the Swedish economy where a lot of people can work from home. People have to go out to the streets to earn little money to be able to put food into their family's table. So, and the health part of this was not taken into account. They were not prepared at all to have an emergency as it. The other democracy that has proven to be resilient in the Middle East and North Africa is, you might guess, Tunisia, because of the flag, of course. It became a democracy in 2011 after the Arab Uprisings. They managed to change the government and has remained a democracy since. For almost 10 years, it is the country in the region that has shown the most democratic advances. It scores on the top 25% worldwide in 6 of the 16 sub-attributes. And fortunately for Tunisia, but unfortunately for the region, after the Arab uprising, is the only successful transition we observe in the region. One of the best performing democracies in Africa, and certainly the best performing democracy in the region. But that doesn't mean that it's a perfect democracy, and much work needs to be done, and they remain to have a lot of challenges that need to be addressed. And the other 2 democracies that we have in the region are like Lebanon. It's a very fragile democracy. It has experienced 2 democratic breakdowns, one between 1976 and 2008, and the other one between 2014 and 2017, before it bounced back to democracy in 2018. But I have to say that it's kind of in the line with all the corruption scandals, change of government, COVID, the explosion last year in the Beirut port. It has driven the country even to a deeper abyss. And the economic and social situation in the country is extremely delicate at the moment. And this, of course, translates into the political situation in the country also being extremely delicate. And Israel is the most stable democracy in Middle East and North Africa, but I have according to the scores, it is one of the most stable democracy. But however, as you all know, it has been cataloged as an apartheid state by Human Rights Watch, and is constantly being questioned due to the conflict that they have with Palestine. So these are like the encouraging developments that we see in the region. Little by little, they are achieving things from a democracy perspective. But then, of course, there are challenges, and there are a lot of challenges in the region. I'm just going to go through 3 challenges, just to the sake of time. And I'm going to describe the ones that I think are most important from a democracy perspective. The first one is, of course, sham elections. The majority of countries in the region do not hold clean elections. And even when they occur, they are likely to be sham elections. Elections remain very problematic in the region. As you can see in the graph, in 2019, 68% of the countries in the region scored below the global average for clean elections, according to the GSOD indices. And in many countries, including countries that are absolute monarchies, like the GCC countries, the Global Cooperation Council countries that are in the Arabian Peninsula, consequential elections are simply not held. In many other countries, elections often lead to widely skewed results. We saw that last week when there were presidential elections in Syria, and Al-Assad maintained his position with 95% of the votes. And in other countries where elections are held, poor practices, including weak enforcement of electoral regulation, the decrease of public trust in the state's capacity to properly administer the elections, have also given place for the elections not to be clean and free. Another thing that we're seeing now, and that we saw even more during 2020 with the COVID pandemic, is the reluctance of the MENA voters to participate in elections. And this often, of course, translates into low turnouts. some of the 2020 elections in the region saw the lowest turnout in decades, Jordan, Iran, for example, and concerns about whether the decision to hold elections were deliberately pursued to influence election results while using the pandemic to justify low turnouts were raised. So it was complicated last year. And another important thing is that the few electoral exercises that are in place in the region have very limited sway on the executive power. So that's something that also needs to be considered. The second challenge that we see is that though democracies are resilient, let's say that non-democracies are also non-resilient, and there's a lot of deepening autocratization in the region. So the region, as I said before, houses 7 of the most persistent authoritarian regimes in the world. In North Africa is South Sudan, that has been authoritarian since the creation of the country in 2011. And in the Middle East, there are 6 countries that are the most persistent authoritarians in the world: Bahrain, Iran, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and the United Arab Emirates. Those are the most persistent authoritarian regimes. They have never seen anything that has not been authoritarian, not even hybridity. And during the last decades, these non-democratic regimes have been taking advantage of their resources and their democratic geographic position. So especially in the Gulf Cooperation Councils in the Arabian Peninsula, because they have kind of created networks that have helped them to stay in power. For example, as I say, the oil-rich Gulf Cooperation Council monarchies of the Arabic Gulf have never experienced democracy, but they rely on the important oil assets and their geopolitical location to sustain their power, and they have been very successful at doing so. So they have maintained historical business and foreign policy ties with not just the United States, but also with Europe. And while some might argue that the political scenario is liable to change and that even Saudi Arabia, but the region in general, is moving towards a post-oil economy, the Middle East countries remain important geopolitical players, even with democracy, human rights, and civil liberties in the region severely curtailed. And this was, we could see it, I think it was like 1 or 2 months ago, with this evergreen ship stocked in the Suez Canal. The geographic position of the Middle East is of extreme importance worldwide. And that was one of the examples that sometimes we just forget about it. Like, oh, we think about like, oh, oil. Oh, yes, they have a lot of oil, but they have the Strait of Hormuz in the Gulf, and they have like the Suez Canal that it's extremely important for commerce all over the world. And also we see like this deepening autocratization that I was talking about before. One of the countries that have been deepening their authoritarian manners is Yemen. But of course, one might argue, well, they have been at war for several years, and I understand it. But another case of deepening autocratization that we see in the region, for example, is Bahrain. That's not at war or in any conflict. In 2009, it had significant declines observed in 2 of its democratic sub-attributes. So freedom of association and assembly and media integrity, it decreased significantly. The government has curtailed the right of free expression and has responded to violence, to protest movements since before the Arab Spring in 2011, and has continued to do so through this last decade. And actually, it was in July 2018 that the UN High Commission for Human Rights, through the Human Rights Committee, called on the Bahraini government to end all its restrictions on freedom of expression and to stop the repression of activists. So in the report, the committee highlighted the fact that Bahrain Anti-Terrorism Act was being used extensively outside the scope of terrorism, including against human rights offenders and to political activists. So the committee encouraged Bahrain to allow peaceful protests. They encouraged to allow freedom of expression, but we have so far not seen anything happening. And then the third challenge to democracy is, of course, the curtailing of civil liberties in the region. But I want to highlight something here. So the adherence to civil liberties has always been one of the weakest points in the region. Freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of movement, of association and assembly have been in decline, though you're seeing a very impressive advance in Tunisia. I want to show you why I put Tunisia as an example. So what we have seen in the last years is that citizens have started to prioritize greater civil freedoms and have asserted their rights, pressuring the government for more accountability and participation in politics. And this has been through the movements that we have seen through the region. So Tunisia should be an example for the region on how to manage civil liberties, because as you can see, they had an incredible advance after the Arab Spring, and this advance has been maintained. It's not like, oh, they had an advance and then they like declined again. No, they went up and they kept, which should be an example for the region. Not unlike, for example, Egypt, that we saw in 2010, 11 go a little bit up, but then it declined. Or Yemen, which was the same case when when Ali Abdullah Saleh, that was the president of Yemen, gave the power. Well, there were elections, but like his vice president became president. And but anyway, in 2011, 2012, there was like an increase on civil liberties because they had the government was more open to free speech, to media integrity, etc. And then, of course, Bahrain, that, as I said before, it's a deepening autocratization country that like saw all the protests that were taking place or that wanted to take place in 2011. The repression for that was extremely high, so much that you cannot even see a light increase in 2011, but even a decrease. And this, of course, brings like this shrinking civic space that I want to talk about now. The Middle East does not have, it's not characterized for having freedom of speech. It's not characterized to having like a good media environment. The media integrity is quite questioned. And of course, there's a lot of protests. So since 2013, after all the movements of the Arab Uprisings started to go down, it has seen the Middle East, this shrinking of the civic space as we measure it within the global state of democracy. And this is particularly in things that have to do with freedom of association and assembly, and freedom of expression, media integrity, and civil society participation. So almost 10 years after the Arab uprisings began, we are seeing nowadays, starting in 2018, this kind of second wave of protests that started in the region and that continue to this day. Protests are trying to open this shrinking civic space a little bit more. They are protesting for what I have said. They are tired of unemployment rates. They are tired of like the economic situation that of course translate into the social reality of the country, into the political reality of the country. They want a change. They want more transparency. They don't want so much corruption within the governments. They really want to see a change, the change that they didn't see in 2011. And actually, you can see that these changes are the protest movements are completely different. For example, in countries like Algeria, like Lebanon, like Sudan and Iraq, the civil unrest was against corruption and unemployment. In Algeria and Sudan, what they achieved lately is that the long-standing head of states in both countries, although Algeria, the regime has recovered a little bit and has more control and stability, but they managed to depart Bouteflika, that had been in power for more than 20 years. And then in Sudan, it happened the same. One thing that didn't change with this protest is that as well as in 2011, most protests were organized through the combination of several means, but social media was like really, really important. What is different now with the protest movements is that before, in 2011, protesters still believed in like opposition or the political actors that were in some way antagonistic to the ruling elite. Nowadays, they don't trust them. They in 2011, they were okay if the opposition comes to power, then it's fine. Nowadays, no, because all the trust that they had in these actors have completely vanished, and they started seeing them as akin to the ruling power. So they really want to clean slate everything from new. One other thing that's very interesting is that in 2011, with the Arab Springs, most of the countries were leaderless. And in 2018, 2019, and 2020, they remain that way. They are still leaderless movements, but now they are conscious leaderless movements. And they are conscious because they are, for example, in Algeria, they are scared that this Hirak movement, that if there are leaders for this movement, they will turn into the political elite, and all the things that have been going on and all the protests and all the demands will not be met, which is a little bit tricky, because you need some kind of leadership to be able to negotiate with like the demands that you are asking for. But they have adopted a completely different approach that they had in 2011. And even though they are not structured like the leader, like this leaderless, sorry, the protests are still more structured than they were in 2011. And I've talked so much, so I'm gonna rush into COVID and what we have seen in COVID-19. What we have seen, according to the Global Monitor, is that the countries in the region, all the countries in the region, put some kind of restriction since the start of COVID-19. Not all the restrictions that were imposed in the region are concerning from a democracy or human rights perspective. So to understand this, let me quickly share that the Global Monitor on the impact of COVID-19 on human rights and democracy, it's a 3-level monitoring tool. So we identify measures taken by governments as concerning, potentially concerning, and like it's fine. So the concerning means that these measures are deemed as undemocratic because they are disproportionate, they are necessary, they are illegal, or they are indefinite. So all the countries have imposed restrictions, but the most affected aspects of democracy, because these measures are concerning because they are disproportionate, or they're disproportionate in the means like if you don't follow the restrictions, there are like extremely high fines or prison sentences, this kind of things. So for personal integrity and security, 16 countries have concerning developments in the MENA region. So basically almost all of them, since we have 21 countries. 10 countries have imposed restrictions or have taken measures that are concerning from a freedom of expression perspective. Freedom of association and assembly has also been one of the most affected aspects of our framework in the MENA region. Media integrity, we have seen the closure of newspapers, we have seen the ban of the distribution of newspapers, magazines, etc., which has, of course, been very worrying. And then the freedom of movement. All of the countries restricted freedom of movement through lockdowns and curfews, border closure, travel restrictions, but 5 of them are concerning because they are disproportionate or they are indefinite, which in this case, in the Middle East and North Africa countries, what we have seen is that the restrictions that have been applied or imposed by the governments, sometimes the time frame is either not clear or completely disproportionate, which of course it's something of concern, and it's something that we have to continue monitoring. And when I was talking about this freedom of movements and the lockdowns and the curfews, one thing that we have seen, and I swear this is the last slide, is the effect that these lockdowns have had in gender equality in the region, and how it has been a terrible step back in all the achievements that women have had in the last decade. So as I said, there have been small steps that they are going up, that gender equality is still an enormous challenge in the region, both in terms of women political representation, but about the situation of women overall. So before the COVID pandemic, some of the most common problems that girls and women had in the region were marriage, like child marriage, domestic violence, and general violence against women. And all the efforts and all the steps forward that they had done, the pandemic has reversed many of them, and it has exacerbated the gender gap in all spheres within. And this is not just for the Middle East. This is all over the world, but we see it more in the Middle East. And one clear example of the impact that these measures that I was talking about, like lockdowns and curfews, have had for women and women rights organizations, that's another thing that's very important, is the increase on domestic violence. So we saw in several countries in the region that the number of calls to domestic violence helpline have increased enormously, but the official reports to the police or to the judiciary have not. And this is, of course, one of the reasons might be because they are unable to report these matters due to the lockdowns, because normally the victims are confined with their perpetrators and they cannot go out and denounce what is happening. And if they can go out, then there was like all this, but you have to quarantine, you cannot go to the center, you like the gender equality, the gender help center, or like civil society organizations that were helping with that. And the problem is not just like the victims being unable to report, but that this women rights organization, they are not being able to help these women in need because, again, of lockdowns or curfews, and sometimes the reduced mobility within the city. And the reality is that in this time of crisis, it is especially hard to escape abuse. And the efforts that women's rights organizations and human rights organizations are doing, even though they are also facing extremely challenging conditions, like they give the victims of abuse like a lifeline, but the gender perspective in COVID has worsened things a lot in the Middle East and North Africa. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much for listening all the way.
Thank you so much. That was very inspiring. And I especially like that you brought up the positive aspects of what's happening, because I feel like we're missing that a lot from today's media, at least. So now it's time for questions. So I'll give the word to Kaisa, who will be moderating this part of the session.
Sorry, there we are. All right, thank you so much, Clara, and thank you so much, Elisenda, for an excellent presentation. It was truly interesting. We now have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. And so yeah, you can write your questions either in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function on Zoom, and I will give you the floor. But I would like to start with posing a question, just like a more general question to you, Elisenda. What do you see, what are your thoughts about the prospects for democracy in the future in this region?
Interesting. I think that the region will continue to experience baby steps towards democracy. I don't think that anyone foresees like a rapid change towards democracy in the region, and I think that the pandemic will be a setback, not in the sense that they are like further curtailing civil liberties, for example, or that they are taking more undemocratic measures because of the pandemic. I personally don't think that has been exacerbated, but what has been exacerbated because of the pandemic is like the whole economic situation and the social situation, that this will translate into, for sure, more protests, more movements, and more need of change. Now, how that change will be and how governments will react, I don't think that we will see much change than we have seen so far, unfortunately.
So let's move on with some questions from the audience. Nelika wanted to ask you about Iran's expected development in terms of democracy, considering their upcoming election in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, we have elections in Iran. I think it's June 16th. Well, the elections in Iran last year, they were parliamentary. Now we're facing the presidential elections. And last year, the voter turnout was extremely low, extremely low. In February, the government decided to go ahead with the elections, knowing that there was a pandemic and knowing that the country was getting a lot of infections. I don't know if you recall, Iran was one of the first countries when they declared the pandemic that was talking about like the number of infections being like expanding really quick, and they still decided to go ahead with the elections, and the voter turnout was very low. And then the second round for those elections was for April, and they postponed it until September. And then that voter turnout for the second round was also extremely low. There are a lot of people saying that the presidential elections will match the voter turnout for the presidential elections in a couple of weeks will match the ones, the last presidential ones that were 73%, if I recall, around 70%. But there are some others that say that it won't even go as much as 30%, which of course will put the elections in this legitimacy lens. Like if the voter turnout is so low, are they legitimate just because like but at the same time, how do you control the voter turnout? So yeah, the situation in Iran is complicated. Also, the candidates that are allowed to present for elections have to, like, there are some requisites, and not all the opposition leaders or parties are able to present for the elections. And with all this together, that if we have a low voter turnout, then the legitimacy of the elections will be questioned. But it is, I wouldn't expect that they are questioned within Iran or within the political elite. So I think that we kind of will stay the same as we are now.
Thank you. So moving on to Emma, she asks if you think that the pandemic will lead to some of the most durable democracies in the regions into hybridity, for example, Tunisia.
Of the 4 democracies that we have in the Middle East, I don't think that Tunisia or Israel will go into hybridity. I think that they might become weak democracies. And the 2 fragile democracies that we have, well, Lebanon is a fragile democracy, and Iraq is a very weak democracy. I don't think that we will see a change into hybridity, at least in the 2-3 years from now. But if I had to say, like, oh, which of the 4 democracies do you think will go into hybridity? I think that Iraq and Lebanon will go in the next 2 or 3 years. Their political systems are very harmed, and the social instability in the country is too high. So either they pull it together and work towards, like, more transparency, less corruption, more strengthening of democratic institutions, or they will just drift from democracy, unfortunately.
Thank you. So we have another question here about Iraq. How do you gauge and look at the quality of the elections? For example, in Iraq, while protest leaders formed new parties to compete in the election scheduled for October, the intimidation and violence is deterring them.
Well, yes. I mean, in January this year, it was because the elections for Iraq were scheduled for June, like next week, and then it was a decision through the council that it was going to be postponed until October, and because also the electoral body said that they needed more time to have free and fair elections. But the truth is, as Shivan is saying, the intimidation and the violence towards the opposition are deterring a lot of political parties or members that were going to present themselves to not do so. And the thing with Iraq is that it's a very complicated country because it's not just about the political elite. You also have to take into account all the militias and their role within the political system. So it's quite complicated. Personally, I do think that the elections will go on in October. I'm not sure about the result, and I'm not sure the response of the movement, like the protest movement, will be. But again, as I said, the protest movement in these countries is kind of leaderless, and in Iraq, you would really need more stability and more structure in the movement if you really want to get something. But but it has been impressive, I have to say, that even though the government and the police have like the extreme brutality that they have used against the protester, they have killed hundreds of people, they have injured thousands, and people are still there. So that should talk about the real need of change and how people will not endure this further. That like they are ready to, they are ready to lose their lives for a change. This like the government should really think a little bit forward, not just on their own interests. And as I say, put corruption aside, be more transparent, and strengthen all the democratic institutions, because your people are asking for it. It's not like, and they're asking not in a very peaceful way, I have to say. Yeah. So
finally, we don't have much time left, but I'll give you some room to discuss. Would you really call Israel a democratic state?
Well, our indices show it is a democratic state. So I understand where the question comes from. As I said, Human Rights Watch and a lot of organizations are calling Israel, and they have been for years, an apartheid state. The thing is, like, when you work with indices, when you work with scores, if the scores are telling you something, you cannot unsay it. So my point is, we have 116 indicators, and each indicator is scored by, I think, like at least five different people to get to that score. And then those scores for each one of the indicators, we aggregate them. So there's like a huge methodology behind it. So yeah, we go through the scores. If I personally think if it's a democratic state, I wouldn't, but I respect the indices that we follow at International IDEA, that we created International IDEA with all these indicators that come from different databases, like the Varieties of Democracy, LID, Policy, etc. So in that sense, yes, Israel is a democracy, but the quantitative part, let's say, says something, and the qualitative analysis, especially because of what we have seen in the last days with this 11-day attacks into Gaza, people might think different. But it's a very tricky question, because it's who you stand for sometimes. But that's why I like the indices, because they are numbers, and like they say it's a democracy. So yes, it is a democracy.
So finally, what's your prediction for Syria?
Well, Assad just won with 90% of the voter turnout. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't see that ending anytime soon.
All right, so we will now have to start wrapping up this webinar. But before we do so, I just wanted to ask you if you have any final thoughts or comments that you would like to share with us.
No, it's been fantastic. I feel a little bit sorry because I overspoke more than I was told to. But no, I think that everything has like the basics have been said, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I really enjoyed. And my email, like, you can share my email. I'm happy to answer any question that all of you have. Visit our GSOD indices, and visit our global monitor of COVID-19's impact on human rights and democracy.
Thank you so much, Elisenda. It was great to have you with us today. I feel like I learned a lot. As Clara mentioned in the beginning, this discussion will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, Fifth Play, where you can watch it again afterwards. And if you enjoy these kinds of events and would like to learn more about global development issues, you can also become a member of Fifth. You can find more information about this on Fifth's website, fifth.se. And also, if you would like to help us arrange these kind of events, you can contact our local group, Fifth Stockholm Södra, by email or on Facebook or Instagram. We're currently looking for new members, so feel free to reach out if you're interested in joining. But also feel free to reach out if you're interested in receiving Elisenda's email if you have any particular questions and you would like to get in touch. You can become an active member even if you do not live in Stockholm, as we do everything remotely and online at the moment. We would love to hear from you and see how you could contribute to this in the future. Finally, we really hope that you enjoyed this discussion and that we would see you again in the future for our next monthly event. So thank you all for joining, and thanks again, Elisenda, for this great, really great session. And have a lovely day, everyone. Take care and see you soon.